Hello, everyone. I just wanted to do a quick stream, or not really quick. If I'm doing the stream, it's going to take a long time. But I wanted to do a stream today because every once in a while I look at the sort of topics I can make videos about, and then I settle on the idea that really I'm not going to get to any of them unless I just do a big stream and talk about all of them, because each one maybe I can make a video on it, or it's going to be only end up being like a couple minutes because it's not really my take on it isn't going to be exactly revolutionary in any way, shape, or form. So I'm just deciding to do this right now, where I just sort of like do this all in the form of a stream. And then I can cover all the topics at once, and then you guys can also ask questions, and we can have a bit of a fun back and forth. That's why I always like to do live streams. A lot of people like to jump on and throw in questions that I've never thought of even answering in the video, so I get to talk about that. But so yeah, I'll just sort of keep rambling a little bit while people slowly filter in, because again, I don't really do announced live streams, so I'll wait until there's at least 15 or 20 people watching. Usually it jumps up pretty fast, but the general topics of tonight, we're going to kind of be that marathon voting session that had taken place yesterday in Parliament, sort of the scandal going on with Jyoti Gondek in Calgary. Calgary's Mayor Jyoti Gondek, of course, if you're not familiar with her, I want to talk a little bit about the Han Dong Chinese interference scandal. He, of course, is the independent MP for Danforth North, but obviously he used to be a Liberal until a lot of information about him and his connections to the Chinese government started popping up. And there's an inquiry that's effectively being already skewed in favor of the Liberal government's narrative by not giving intervener status to the Conservative Party and not letting them actually cross-examine witnesses and ask questions. Only a few Conservative MPs or witnesses are allowed to testify at this inquiry. No one's actually allowed. They're not actually allowed to, hold anyone accountable and ask questions under oath, which is kind of the whole deal with being an intervener. Like the Conservative Party was literally targeted. Every single targeted MP of like 8 that we know of were all conservatives, yet the Conservative Party doesn't get to ask any questions. This thing is obviously being engineered a lot like the Freedom Convoy sort of inquiry that had happened, where it's basically just going to push the Liberals' narrative, and everything else is basically just going to be left at the roadside. But where I want to start off with this, and it kind of turns in, it sort of hinges on my point that I've baked into the title of this video, is about the Liberals crushing the poor. Because what we're hearing about this, like, sort of voting marathon that's going on right now in Parliament is that, like, don't know how to say this exactly, but basically that somehow the Conservatives are voting against every single sympathetic group in the country. They're voting against resources for First Nations people. They're voting against resources for the poor. They're voting against the military. They're voting against the police. When really it's just that the Liberals are baking in a bunch of bad spending into what could be good spending bills, and they're having the Conservatives oppose them. The Conservatives are also opposing them basically because they want to get all of the carbon tax across the country. They want to get the entire carbon tax frozen for now, that people shouldn't have to pay it while everyone's financially hurting if people in the Maritimes don't have to pay it on their heater oil. And the Liberals are then trying to counter by saying, well, why are you holding up a vote on resources for First Nations people? It's an incredibly cynical thing to do. And when you actually look at the Liberals' voting record and just record in terms of policy of helping poor people, it's been horrible. There's a reason why our per capita income has been going down in this country. It's not just because of high immigration. It's also just because of the high costs of living and the stagnating wages of people as the actual costs of housing and food have been going up. I'll jump over to Ali Bardia right now. Why should we vote for you? So I guess that's a great question to start off with. Well, there's not too many people here. It's also great to front load this to the start of the video when there's, some people might be rewatching the live stream after it's done. But obviously I'm running for, or not obviously if you don't know it yet, I'm running for the Calgary Signal Hill Conservative Party nomination. Calgary Signal Hill kind of being on the west side of the city. It's been a very, very long time Conservative alliance and reform riding. I don't think it's ever been liberal since it's been created. But with or maybe back in like the 1920s or something like that. But it's been a very long time since Liberals are ever competitive around this area. I'm running against like 12 other people right now. And kind of the problem that we end up having in this area of the city is that you get a lot of people who they would run if they as a liberal if the liberals had a chance, but they don't, so they end up running as conservatives. You get a lot of people in these strong conservative ridings who I would say have HOA personalities. Not trying to be rude to anyone, but there's people who would serve on any board if it was available. It's not a character flaw. They like contributing to the community. But you get a lot of people who are not particularly conservative getting involved in conservative politics to be involved in the community. But so you end up lacking a lot of conservative principles. So I'm trying to run in order to re-inject conservative principles, be a very outspoken conservative who's willing to work hard to get policy across the finish line. And then an added bonus is I actually live in the riding. And I'm not the biggest critic of people carpetbagging, but when you don't have a good record that you're running on and you're not particularly conservative and you're carpetbagging, that's a bit of an issue to me, is when the only thing that you could say about yourself is that you're against the carbon tax and really nothing else, and you kind of keep your views vague on every other issue. Should you really be running in a safe conservative riding? We should be using our safe conservative ridings the way the NDP, the Liberals, the Bloc, and the Greens use them. You put one of your strongest advocates in those ridings and that they can say whatever they want without feeling like at risk of losing an election because of something they said in Parliament that they believed in. You use your stronger ridings to make sure that the rest of the country votes for your party more by having people who feel at liberty to speak, who can advocate strongly for the positions of that party. When you have only weak, kind of wishy-washy conservatives occupying strong ridings, they end up almost acting as a roadblock for real conservative people in the party because they don't want you taking strong conservative positions, and they're the people who are not at risk of losing races. So they end up being in like politics for a very long time in those ridings because they can't be removed. So then they end up shaping the party's character over time. And this is where we ended up, in my opinion, with an Aaron O'Toole. We had a lot of people around the party who weren't particularly focused on conservative principles, just on winning elections, so that because they had occupied their ridings for potentially decades, they had ended up shaping the party in this more Brian Mulroney, Aaron O'Toole direction, so that the party was set up to willing to accept a man like O'Toole, when if the party was run by people who were more principled, I think O'Toole from caucus itself would have been called out well before he ever got even close to winning the leadership as being effectively a fake conservative. Sausage Slap says, "What's up, Wyatt?" Not much, just a Saturday night wanted a live stream to be able to cover a bunch of political topics. And I just answered the question of why I was running for the conservative nomination for Calgary Signal Hill. If you live in Calgary Signal Hill, make sure to buy your membership and vote for me once the vote comes up. I still have to fill out all of my paperwork. I'm getting very close to having it in and getting approved as a candidate, but there's like 12 people here, and it's going to be a bit of a crazy circus no matter who wins, just simply because of the sheer amount of candidates, and more candidates actually leads to very strange races. Anyways, so what I was wanting to talk about when it comes to this marathon voting, I covered it a little bit, but the Conservatives are just holding up these 135 spending bills and slowing them down, arguing against all of them, filibustering, in order to try and put some sort of discomfort on the Liberals and force them to consider or vote for a freeze in the carbon tax, because the Conservatives are allowed to propose bills as the opposition into Parliament. So they have their own bill to try and pause or freeze the carbon tax on all emissions, or on every single thing that like the carbon tax currently applies to, because obviously a bunch of Maritimers, about 50% of them or 40%, do not pay the carbon tax on their heating bill, which was the Trudeau government admitting that the carbon tax was hurting people and that the carbon tax is no longer universal. So why should any Canadian have to pay it if some Canadians aren't having to pay it? And this isn't like you're living in poverty, so you shouldn't have to pay it. This is just anyone who had heater oil doesn't have to pay it, which is a very broad group of people and does not target a specific, socioeconomic demographic of people. But yeah, so that's where that's at. And that the Liberals are then using the fact that a lot of the votes that the Conservatives are holding up or abstaining from voting on, and basically ensuring that the bills pass as slowly as humanly possible to try and pressure the Liberals into getting rid of the carbon tax, that because some of the spending bills are for sympathetic kinds of things like trying to support First Nations people, or supporting the poor, or supporting the police or the military or whatever, or some aid bill for some disaster zone, that means the Conservatives are being horrible people. again, I don't think this is going to work out for the Liberals, because when the Conservatives make it very clear that they're doing this to hold up votes in order to try and get the carbon tax removed, nobody actually buys that somehow the Conservatives are heartless. If anything, it's the Liberals who are heartless, who keep cramming down on poor Canadians in favor of their environmental agenda. And that's kind of where I wanted to move on from here. Delta Mail actually had a good question. Are you well received in that riding? Calgary Signal Hill, where I'm running as Conservative candidate. Honestly, the doors have been super friendly so far. The stereotype of Calgary Signal Hill, because in Canada, obviously, our ridings are so geographically big, they almost end up taking on their own cultures, even if it's a little bit subtle riding to riding. Calgary Signal Hill, I would say, maybe for the past decade or two, maybe 15, 20 years, you would say it was less of a conservative riding and more of a capitalist riding. I am an actual full spectrum kind of a conservative, but I've noticed over the past 5 to 8 years or so that there's way more people who are actually more principled conservatives, either entering the riding, or people who were previously more so just fiscal conservatives becoming fiscal and social conservatives, because the argument that O'Toole was putting forward and Scheer was putting forward too was in their election campaigns is that technically everything the Liberals are doing is fine as long as we were paying less taxes. And that's not a winning strategy. And I think a lot of people have realized over time that the rot from the Liberal government is not just the carbon tax. It's not just a couple bad economic regulations. It's the fact that they fundamentally hate the country. The Liberals just do not like Canada as a country. This is why they changed the lyrics to the national anthem. This is why Justin Trudeau comes out and accepts the ridiculous report from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's group that was saying that Canada's committing an ongoing genocide. That's completely that's a fallacious point to have made, and Justin Trudeau fully accepted it because he believes that Canada should be a post-national state without an identity, and it's just some sort of dumping ground for whoever wants to show up to do whatever, and you don't have to, take on any character of the country. You don't have to, try and get along with anyone else. You don't have to even sign. You could barely have to sign the guest book in order to come into Canada. It's quite disheartening over time, but I think a lot of voters over time, it's less compelling to them, the red Tory argument that, who cares about social issues? Let's just lower the taxes. Because I'd rather, and I'm not saying this as a platform point, but I'd rather keep the carbon tax in place and get rid of a lot of the social policies of the Liberals, because those are far more destructive. Obviously, if I was an MP, I'd vote to get rid of all of it. But that's just my point, is that there's a lot of social issues that the Liberals have been pushing in legislation and in the culture that have been far more destructive than a lot of their economic attacks on the country. But those are still the same sort of attacks. I think in a certain sense, the carbon tax is the Liberals trying to punish Canada for being a prosperous Western country, because they know that they're not reducing emissions. I think it's basically just a club to use against the capitalist system of Canada. And Stephen Guilbeault, our environment minister, I think he still is the environment minister, he literally declared himself a socialist in Parliament. And I think when they literally tell us who they are, we should probably believe them. But now this is me just getting to another point. Unless there's a question here, I'm just scrolling. Well, that's to answer the question of how well received am I in the riding. I think it's actually been pretty good, because I'm more of a social conservative and the riding has become more socially conservative. More people have kids and more people are realizing that they don't want woke nonsense in their kids' schools. So even though I'm running for a federal job, the federal government should take charge in trying to claw back education grants or equalization fees to provinces whose education systems are teaching left-wing woke nonsense, because it's a misallocation of Canadian taxpayer money. Anyways, but to get back to it, what's going on in Parliament is quite disgusting, with the Liberals trying to accuse the Conservatives of somehow opposing good things because they're abstaining from votes or filibustering votes in order to try and put pressure on the Liberals to reduce the carbon tax. Because it's been the Liberals who have been crushing the poor for the last 8 years. It's them who keeps putting on regulations and starting different programs that ostensibly are supposed to support the poor, but ends up actually making them poorer over time. There's actually a great documentary that Milton Friedman made back in the day. It's called Free to Choose, and he makes a very good point that every single social measure that's supposed to help poor people, like a lot of welfare programs, rent control, different redistribution schemes, different grants for the poor. All this stuff usually ends up not actually helping the poor because it's usually those more in the middle class who can technically still qualify for these services and programs, who are usually the more savvy people at sort of being able to utilize the system to get the money that they want. So in the Free to Choose documentary, they were showing that all these apartment buildings in New York and Chicago that were in rent control were usually occupied by people who could actually easily go and pay average rent prices. But they were quite savvy at being able to manipulate the system in order to get these homes where it was poor people themselves who actually couldn't get them. So they were paying the regular prices for an apartment building or for an apartment rent. And they were actually having to pay more because they were subsidizing those living in rent control. Every single progressive policy is not actually helping the poor, and conservatives, and this is where I might even transition to talking about Jody Gondek and just progressive municipal politicians in general. Their actual policies, it doesn't matter how much they say they're helping the poor, all their policies do is crush the poor. And especially their environmental policies, they're supposed to help the planet. That not only do they not help the planet, they usually make the poor worse off. The carbon tax, no matter what rebates the government's giving out, yes, the poor gets more money back in the rebates than they do pay on the carbon tax on their gasoline, but the carbon tax applies to way more than gasoline. So the poor end up paying way more back in the carbon tax across all the different products than they actually get back in the rebates. Things like the single-use plastic ban and the plastic bag bans that have been going on in several cities, those were way more hurtful for people who are living in sort of like the bottom rung of society, because all these banned materials usually cost more than the ones at grocery stores and other restaurants and places like that are then required to use. And even if you look at it, or these sort of upper class liberal elites look at it and say, well, it's only just an extra 5 cents for blah, 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 or you only have to pay 45 cents for reusable bags. Well, those reusable bags, you have to wash them. Unless you want to get food poisoning, you actually have to wash those bags. And if you don't, even if you forget one at home, you have to pay an extra 50 cents to get another bag, and you're going to have multiple ones, and they're eventually going to run out. It was actually kind of nice that you could get free bags to carry your groceries home with, but because these people live in a bubble, these liberal elites live in a bubble, they don't realize that, taking another $25, $30 because of the single-use plastic bag ban in different cities being implemented, that just because you can handle that $30 doesn't mean that it's not going to actually be very detrimental to somebody else. I just want to take this comment from Oxsquirt. I think that's what you're called. He said, I don't really care if the poor even gets more back from the carbon tax. I'm not poor and I pay way more than I get, but I'm not so rich that I don't notice it. I notice it a lot. And yeah, and the thing is too, the government too, trying to create these programs where they're trying to give the poor back more than they give is just a kind of a big scam in the first place, because oftentimes administering these programs cost so much money that even if they were benefiting the poor a little bit more, they end up hurting the middle class quite a bit, so that these people are not so that you're not actually increasing prosperity. Progressives will pretend that they're increasing prosperity through their different programs, and they're not actually increasing prosperity in any way. They're just reducing overall prosperity for the goal of increasing prosperity in a particular part of the economy or particular part of the sort of socioeconomic pool. But at the end of the day, it never actually works out, because the bureaucracy that it takes to manage all these programs end up costing way more than the programs benefit anybody. It's like that. Again, I think this was from the Free to Choose documentary, and this has been noted several times in other places too, that if you were to take all the money that goes into operating the welfare system, and you were to just, rather than dividing up all the money that actually goes towards operating the welfare programs, whether it's bureaucracy, delivery, or whatever else, and you just divide up that money and gave it to poor people, you would be tripling or quadrupling the amount of money they would get back in benefits. but because most of the money goes towards paying people to administer the programs, it ends up just being this big sort of employment scam where a bunch of people out of university, who have liberal arts degrees or whatever, end up getting these welfare bureaucracy jobs that pay them quite a bit of money in order to dole out very little bits of cash. So that's where we actually do need to do a big forensic audit of these programs and just look at how much money is actually going towards the things that they are claiming it is. It's kind of the whole scam that ends up taking place with charities, is that a lot of charities do not actually give that much money to the causes that they supposedly represent, because it's just the rule of any business is that when you're not actually profit motivated, you end up wasting a lot of money on yourself rather than the poor people or the homeless or the drug addicted or whoever else, the vulnerable that you are supposedly protecting. So I think that's also a good case for why I think the government needs to give less money in grants to nonprofits and charitable organizations, because it seems like the government gives the money just based on the idea that their about page says such nice things about themselves rather than if they actually do any good work. This is a bit of a story from the provincial election in Alberta in 2023 here. I bumped into, in one of the ridings, Calgary, Curry, several people just down singular blocks who were supposedly in charge of running their own nonprofit groups, and they were voting NDP because they were mad that the UCP cut their nonprofit budget a little bit. And like every time I talked to them, because I would always act kind of sympathetic about the whole thing. Well, if you're doing work, that's horrible, blah, 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 blah. And you couldn't nail them down on what they actually did. So many of these nonprofits did nothing. They were just nonprofits where basically they employed three like chumps to get hundreds of thousands of dollars a year between themselves to deliver just nebulous services. Like, as a lot of the DEI scam is that obviously there's no real physical product at the end of the day through DEI programs. There's nothing that actually benefits anyone in a material manner. And even the abstract benefits of we made a more inclusive workplace, not only is that fake, and most of these DEI type programs make places less tolerant and inclusive because it just makes them more left-wing and more left-wing supremacist, is that the thing is that we were literally having hundreds of thousands to hundreds of millions of dollars in Canada, across Canada, being given, actually it's probably billions at this point, being given to organizations that literally do not do anything other than basically paying people to not to sit around and exist. It's actually kind of pathetic when you realize just the sheer number of people. It's not it's not getting close to 20 or 30%, but there's single digits up to 10% of people in this country who work fake jobs. They have fake jobs. They go to work and they create PowerPoint presentations about, inclusivity in the sanitation department in some workplace. And every once in a while, people have to look at their presentations. They hate it. And then they go back to actually doing real work. These people, think about all the people in schools. This is where actually I'm very sympathetic towards nurses, doctors, and teachers, even though I think their unions heavily misrepresent them. Think about all the HR and just administrative jobs that the unions fight for, even more than they actually fight for the real frontline workers that they supposedly represent. Think about how much money you could actually give to people who deliver real services in the government if you cut all the HR and administrative jobs. I wish conservatives, it's not because they've never tried it, I think it's a bit of an abstract marketing idea for politics, that they need to target upper management union type positions, these HR types, these people who are just the 17th vice principal in a single school. I've heard from people who work in schools. Administration, just people who are vice principals, superintendents, other sort of HR positions have quintupled over the past 30 years or so. Think about how much more each teacher could be paid, and think about how much you could reduce class sizes by just paying each individual teacher more to do an actual job that actually benefits people. But it's a great way of buying votes by having nonprofit groups who not only do you get those nonprofit individuals voting for you, but they're likely to volunteer on campaigns because they realize that the party who ended up offering them the grants are the way that they keep getting funded. But also a lot of these nonprofit groups effectively just push left-wing ideology into the public. So they end up being like a PAC on behalf of a Liberal or NDP government without actually being explicitly political. But a lot of this DEI rhetoric is political, and we've even seen this exposed in the past. It's been a while. But some of these DEI people and people who create curriculums or do sort of like little bits of work in schools, they literally will call conservatives racist, and they will say that it's problematic to vote conservative based on their quote unquote neutral and objective takes as a DEI expert. It's really disgusting. Sorry, I just saw a question from Ali here. Is it the job of the government to support people in Canada, even if they are poor, or should it be the attitude of the people it is to, by default, not to rely on but support? Sorry, I'm always terrible at reading. Or should it be that the attitude of people is to, by default, not rely on but rather support the government? Yeah, and like that's a big thing. Is I think there has been a culture shift over the past 50 years in just Western countries in general that it used to be that the government didn't have a massive budget, so people were more willing to say, yeah, the people support the government to give us some basic services. But now it's that like the government people just see it as an active, and that's an entity that's literally supposed to support you fully, like, you know, cradle to grave type programs. And it's like it's not even good for the individuals that you're giving money to, because it's getting them to basically believe in or set their sights on what is a standard of living actually lower than what they would if they were working and they realize that they could take charge of their own life. You could work minimum wage in Canada and make way more than you would on welfare. But the thing is that a lot of the welfare programs themselves seem very cushy and easy, so that more people, and I was literally yelled at, not quite yelled at, but someone got very elevated, a professor in my master's program, when I asked the genuine question, how do you design a welfare program in order so that you don't incentivize too many people to basically sit at home and not work? And they got mad at me and said, there's no evidence that people who are on welfare don't want to work. If you survey them, they'll tell you they want to work. That's nonsense. Obviously, there's going to be people in any program who are not genuinely there for the program's purpose, but they're so ideological, they cannot admit that there is such a thing as a welfare exploiter. They wouldn't actually, but so they got ticked off and they said, well, there's no evidence. What do you mean evidence? This is what I actually get so mad about in academia. If people say, where's your evidence of that? It's like, what do I have to have a study to show you that people suck sometimes? People suck, and some people are going to sit on welfare. So it is a legitimate question. How do you create a welfare sort of balance where the benefits aren't so little that someone would starve to death, but at the same time, you're not giving someone so much that why would I go and work when I can get more by just sitting at home? And even then, she was saying this post-COVID, post the years where people would literally quit their jobs to get on CERB because CERB paid more. I was working in like a liquor store, and I had people who would quit in like both our location, I think we had one person, and other locations in the branch because it paid more to just go on to CERB. And obviously you had to pay taxes on it, just like you had to pay taxes for the money you got while you were working. But if you saved a big chunk of it, you could easily pay the taxes. It was insane. Kevin is asking about Bill C-21, and you mentioned the gun bans. Is that the handgun ban, or is it just the assault weapons ban, quote unquote assault weapons ban? I think with the future of gun bans, it's based on following the CCFR and all the legal challenges, and the fact that the Liberals, I believe, have said they're not going to actually pursue trying to confiscate any of the guns on their lists until after 2025. I think they're basically trying to just shove that off as a political issue. They don't actually want to have to talk about it in an election. So they're basically saying, not until we're probably lost and we're out of government are we actually going to enforce this policy. And obviously, if they win another election, it's probably something miraculous where they get another majority and they kind of do whatever they want. So they're trying to insulate themselves from their own policy. It's the exact same thing as the Liberals removing the carbon tax for heater oil. They're just trying to basically just trying to close the blast doors around where their ship is leaking water so it doesn't sink the entire vessel. At this point, I don't think they can save themselves. Look at any polling. It's horrific. Issue by issue polling is almost even worse than the polling itself, and fundraising numbers are even worse than all that. The Conservatives are more than doubling the Liberals' fundraising numbers, and when you actually go to who do you trust to handle the economy, those things heavily favor the Conservatives. The only thing that the Liberals are ahead in is stuff about who cares most about the environment and who is like, like the more caring and progressive party. But those are kind of very waffle-ish kind of questions to ask people that like it's basically saying, hey, all like every liberal is just going to say the liberals are, and the Conservatives don't care about those metrics because they're very left-wing oriented metrics. So they might even say, yeah, the liberals do care more about the environment. I also don't really care because it doesn't. Who cares more about the environment if people are one, they're not even reducing emissions by what they're doing, and two, they're lowering people's standard of living. So it's a kind of a self-defeating issue, because when this next election is kind of gearing up to be an affordability election, people don't really care if that the liberals are more caring about the environment. They just want the party that's not going to destroy their wallets. And like that's not to say that like obviously like the Conservatives don't care about the environment. Conservatives care about the environment probably more than the liberals. That's why Conservatives propose stopping sludge being just dumped into the Montreal, like the river or St. Lawrence River from Montreal, or for Elizabeth May's riding, ironically enough, to stop dumping sewage into the sea. That's an actual environmental policy I could get behind, not nebulously trying to reduce emissions so that CO2 makes up slightly less than 400 parts per million of the atmosphere. Like it's almost sort of pseudoscience to pretend that CO2 is like the main thing driving the climate, considering that CO2 was pretty consistent before the Industrial Revolution, yet we still have massive change in the climate. And what are these people believing? That 400 parts per million of the atmosphere is like creating this giant shell around the Earth and preventing any heat from escaping? It's just really not how it works in any way, shape, or form. Does it influence the environment somehow? What? Sure. Just as, pretty much anything is going to influence the heat of the Earth. Like the more matter on Earth of any variety is going to dictate whether it's colder or warmer and what that matter is. But I don't really think that it's specifically like the Earth changed just how the heating works, and now it's purely CO2 is the main factor, whether before it was all these other things that you did. Like even just the angle and the position to the sun, if we move a mile closer or further away, that's probably going to have a much bigger impact than CO2 does. Anyways, great question from Countryside. Do you think there would be an early election? No. I was specifically told by a Conservative MP from Nova Scotia that they are literally called up by Air Canada saying, do you guys also want a campaign jet like the Liberals are booking? And that's when they know an election is going to happen. Everyone's pushing this idea that, hey, the NDP, the president of the NDP says that there's an election coming, or that he could see an election happening in the spring. If anybody says there could be an election in the spring, there's not going to be an election in the spring, because if there was going to be, they would definitely say there is 100% is going to be an election this spring, because that would raise more money than just saying there could be. But these party presidents and just like party officials don't want to be called up by their own base saying, hey, you said there was going to be an election in March and there wasn't. So they just kind of use vaguer language because that still increases fundraising. It makes a great excuse to have a few fundraising emails around the Christmas season. Especially in a party like the Liberals and NDP who don't have a lot of money. So they're trying to like sort of squeeze out as much money before the end of the year, in which then their donors can have a fully new $1,750 that they can give to the party. Anyways, but yeah, a lot of I almost hate whenever people start trying to do election predictions based on your own logic, and I believe you're probably with me on this. Do you feel like the Liberals think they can win another election? Do you feel like the NDP has any incentive for an election right now? Like, in a certain sense, they actually do. But from the perspective of Jagmeet Singh's leadership style and the fact that he's very conciliatory to the Liberals, do you think that there's going to be an election? There's just no way that the Liberals or the NDP are going to volunteer to get clobbered this early. They're going to wait it out until the very end. Again, if the Liberals were smart, like I said in other videos, they would actually push for an earlier election than later, because if they hold on for dear life until they absolutely must call an election, that's when you're actually going to have a lot of voters start to like resent the fact that while well past the point where voters actually wanted them to stay in office, they kept holding on. That's what, in my opinion, killed the Social Credit Party in BC and Alberta, and even in like Quebec, after their charismatic leaders had left the parties and they had really no reason to exist. Their government still held on way past the point where voters wanted them gone, which made them a very tired brand. Where if they called an election faster right after they lost their leaders, didn't do very well in the election, but held on to maybe most of their seats or some portion of them, then they could have justified themselves into the future, held a leadership election, gotten a better leader. But because they were just kind of holding on with whatever mediocre kind of politicians they had still in the party on as long as possible, that's when people just kind of got tired of them, and then they started heavily underperforming in the polls. Oh, and this is Sausage Slap says, Salat Singh wants that pension. I don't actually think that Jagmeet Singh wants his pension. I think he wants his pension in the sense that if you ask him, do you want it or do you not want it? He'd say, yes, I want it, in terms of like, obviously he's not going to give up his pension. The thing with Jagmeet Singh, though, is he could at this point probably make a lot more money by resigning as leader and then starting up a legal practice. Because again, lawyers can make a crazy amount of money. A lawyer with a heavy, big profile like Jagmeet Singh, where he could potentially offer lobbying services or legal services as a sort of pseudo celebrity lawyer, he could make way more money in that sort of line of work. I think Jagmeet Singh just genuinely has such a massive ego. He likes the fact that he's a leader of a party. He doesn't mind that he's completely unconsequential in a certain sense. And he's one of the worst political tacticians that exist in Canada. He could get everything he wants from the Liberals right now by threatening elections and by holding up votes and doing all this other stuff. He doesn't, because he just doesn't care, and he's terrified of losing his position as a leader of a party, because he just likes the idea, or at least in my opinion, I think he just likes the idea that when you have to take the snapshot of history in 2023, you technically do have to talk about Jagmeet Singh. If there's ever a big Netflix series made about Canadian politics, there's a few episodes where they do have to mention Jagmeet Singh a few times. Whereas I think that his pension at the end of the day is not going to be that much. The minimum pension that you get after 6 years is like, I think after he turns past a certain age, which is still like 10 years away for him or even longer. So it's not like his pension's right around the corner. He's only going to get like a few $1,000s a month. It's not that massive until you've like been in parliament for like a couple decades. Because I think you get the minimum after 6 years, and then every 2 or 3 or 4 years after that, it increases by a little bit per month. But so I just don't see him being one of those people who actually cares about the pension. He's more of like he acts like on social media. He's more of just sort of like an influencer. He just likes the social economy of getting a lot of attention. Yeah, no, I agree with that. It is a prestige thing that he gets to have the pension, and that he was leader for a long enough to get the pension. But I mentioned this in a previous video. It is almost kind of remarkable, the fact that Jagmeet Singh has been the NDP leader through 2 losses. And obviously the NDP is never going to form a government in the near future in Canada. I say loss by the fact that the NDP did not gain in elections where there was a good ability for them to gain a lot of seats. They lost a lot of seats under Mulcair because he just didn't have the charisma to hold the party together the way Jack Layton did. But so Jagmeet Singh had a massive deficits of seats to win back. Places that hadn't voted NDP before, who had gotten used to the idea of it, that Jagmeet Singh could have made inroads in. And people point to it like, well, he wasn't going to do good in Quebec because he's Sikh and they have a very secular culture there. Okay, fair enough. But how did he end up losing even more seats in other ridings? It's insane. There's like the problem with it is that Jagmeet Singh, and again, this goes along with the idea that I don't think he's doing this for the pension. He's doing this for the attention. He doesn't really like union voters, because union voters are actually very blue collar and socially conservative in a certain sense. You get the hyper progressives who are very active in the unions, but the sort of more general base of labor voters, I think Jagmeet Singh doesn't like them. He finds them icky. They don't believe in all the progressive things. They don't go to, aesthetically pleasing donut shops like he does, where they put like candy and bacon on like ridiculously overpriced donuts, because they're not like Jagmeet Singh. He does not want to hang out with them. So he has expanded the party's base, or not really. He's more so pivoted and then shrunk the party's base to being like a party for student union activists. I, as someone who was on my student union's academic advisory board, am picturing those people now. They're very, very concerned with progressive, posturing, sort of welfare programs and socialistic type policies, not because they actually believe they're efficient, but they believe in the morality of socialism. These are the kind of people that Jagmeet Singh has very much adopted as his voters. It's like his voters are like the HR workers in unions and kind of white college girls. That's his base. It's people who very much care about the fact people who like it would be the type of person that would follow Jagmeet Singh on TikTok is kind of the base that he wants. His base, unfortunately for him, is still like labor. It's still like union people because they're just the NDP so well dug into many unions. But he's been killing off his votes, and this is why unionized voters are now polling best with conservatives. And then second place, I think actually it's not even second place. I think the Liberals and the NDP are basically tied because the NDP doesn't do anything for them anymore. I never thought the NDP was good back in the day, but you could at least say that they were unapologetic advocates for the union position. Now they're very much unapologetic advocates for the sort of social policies unions push, but it's not because the unions believe in them. It's just because union like political infrastructures, the sort of like advocacy structures within unions were taken over by socially left-wing people. So over time, they've actually cared less about the sort of like collective bargaining and economic issues that labor unions usually exist for. And now they care more about like the social stuff. This is where you have Fred Hahn in QP Ontario, like stumping against Israel and basically supporting Hamas. This is like very much the kind of reason why I think Jagmeet Singh hasn't been punished as much as he should be for ignoring his labor base. Is because the unions also ignore their labor base. But because of the power they have to basically bully their own members, they can push enough votes over the NDP. The party hasn't absolutely collapsed, but the party has collapsed in its economic viability long term because it's a party that runs mostly in college towns in very granola progressive areas. When I say granola progressive areas, I mean very kind of earthy type progressive urban voters. That's kind of like who the NDP relies on. Young people who have the kind of very revolutionary political ideas that they got from certain progressive YouTubers. There's a reason why Jagmeet Singh does live streams with like Hassan Piker and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the US. It's because that's who his people are voting for him now are kind of watching. And maybe this is a good time to kind of transition to another issue about polling and the way that the left-wing parties have kind of hurt themselves. In the US, the stereotype with the Democrats and the Republicans is the Republicans tend to be a more older party in terms of the age demographics who vote for them. It's changing a little bit on the sort of younger side where it's become a bit more split up because of how bad the Democrats are performing. But the Democrats are usually considered the more young, obviously more progressive party. And when I say progressive, I'm not saying it like a good thing. I'm just using the language they use. I find a lot of the progressives, which when I talked about Jody Gondek, you'll make it very clear, they're not actually progressive. They're just left-wing supremacists who sort of frame all their policies as being sort of progressive and tolerant when they're the least tolerant people you've ever met. But in Canada, the Liberal Party and the NDP is basically the Democrats cut down the middle, not in terms of, I don't think the party is exactly it's not like they're vote splitting. I think the parties do end up serving two different types of people, but the NDP is very much the young side of the party and the Liberals are the old side of the party if you were to combine the two together. The Liberals are actually, they overperform usually depending on the poll, but the people that the Liberals actually do well with are people 65 plus. It's very old voters who vote Liberal mostly. The Conservatives are actually very well positioned because although they're winning every demographic right now, that's just a consequence of the fact that they're so far ahead. But the Conservatives are usually most appealing these days to people between the ages of like 34 and 55. It's kind of that middle-aged demographic. That's a very good demographic to have because those people vote a lot and they're the biggest part of the population. The NDP mostly has that 18 to 34 crowd. They're still obviously behind the Conservatives right now, but they're disproportionately polling well with them. A group of people who, unfortunately for the NDP, does not show up and vote very frequently. And then the Liberals have this 65-plus voter demographic. And I think it's because the NDP has, because of their more revolutionary, hyper-progressive policies, they make older voters concerned because although the NDP promises more benefits and social benefits, the changes that they would make and their kind of lack of respect for private business, I think makes older voters who, even if they're more liberal, understands that the NDP would be heavily toxic for the economy. The liberals are also toxic for the economy, but a little bit less so, so that I think these voters kind of trick themselves into thinking that the liberals still have some respect for the market economy. They really don't, but this is where 65 plus voters vote liberal so heavily, in terms of like disproportionately, because the liberals basically offer safety blanket policies that they're going to increase their old age pension benefits and all this other sort of stuff, that they're going to, support the public healthcare system. They're going to give away the most or keep robust services in place, where they're not really promoting new services and like new kind of economic measures that concern older voters, but they kind of keep all the services that are currently in place more beefed up than the NDP would, so that these older voters who are more risk averse end up liking the liberals. That's kind of the funny thing, is that the liberals are a very unambitious party in a certain sense. They pass a lot of legislation, but a lot of their legislation, unlike the NDP or the Conservatives, are not kind of forward thinking and visionary. Again, the visionary policies of the NDP are horrific. At the same time, like the Conservatives also, I mean that they want to change kind of the way Canada works a little bit. So the Conservatives want a very much more small business, or not small business, small government, pro-family kind of vision for the country right now under Poilievre. Jagmeet Singh, it's very much a trade unionist, big bloated government kind of a future. The Liberals don't really offer a vision. They're more so, their vision is, imagine all the benefits the government is currently giving you, plus a little bit more, and we'll make sure that those benefits keep coming. That's really what they are offering. It is the warm bath kind of policy book. Like Trudeau, that's kind of Trudeau's fault too. He kind of entered office in 2015 pretending that he was more revolutionary than he was. And although he's done terrible things, it's mostly the extension of pre-existing bad policies and regulations that he's turned up to 11. So we had environmental protections and some taxes for pollution back in the day, and then he extended that to carbon taxes. So he's never done something like Jagmeet Singh would, where he would actually push for like phasing out of coal and oil and gas and natural gas across the country, and forcing different cities and like jurisdictions to use green energy, green tech. But so Trudeau kind of moves down the road, but so slowly that he doesn't sort of freak out his older base. Sorry, I wanted to see. I wish someone would explain to me why I should care about Israel-Palestine problems. This is from some guy with using Trudeau's blackface photo. But I don't think that you have to care. I think that in a certain sense you should care, just from the idea that I wish Western forces and Western ideals would win over both hard left-wing ideals and sort of crazy fanatical Islamist ideals. I think that at the end of the day, Israel is a proxy for the West to basically keep on surviving. And the thing is, if we only care about our own shores and we only care about what happens internally, you're going to be inviting for the world to become a far darker place that we cannot stop from infecting our country with bad ideas and, hostile sort of action. It's why, I wanted to protect Taiwan. I know Canada really doesn't have the capacity to do that much for Taiwan, but overall, let's say we're the United States and we have far more power. Obviously, you should back up Taiwan, because if China takes over Taiwan and they take over the microchip building sort of, I guess, industry, they have far more ability to influence our elections. They have far more ability to influence our culture. They have far more ability to actually actively threaten us. That's where I think that actually a lot of foreign policy issues matter deeply, is that the whole point of protecting allies overseas is so that you don't have to protect yourself later without your allies, is that they end up being kind of the buffers around our country. So you have to kind of see them a little bit as extensions of ourselves, buffering Canada from the worst elements of the communist East, as well as kind of like the Islamist Middle East, that you want to keep those Islamist forces in the Middle East, in Iran, in Qatar, in the Houthis in Yemen at bay, so that we don't have to deal with them later. I don't like a lot of the mass immigration that's gone on. Obviously, that's also been bad. So, but don't kind of mistake bad liberal policies for what the West stands for. A lot of the people who support Israel in the liberal government or support Ukraine in the liberal government, these are the same people who actually kind of don't care when Putin invaded back in 2014 or when Israel was being rocketed prior to October 7th. They're kind of latecomers and they just realized optically they had to back them up. But these kind of far left liberal types in the West are the biggest allies to like the CCP and to Iran and to Islamists and to Khalistani radicals and to other sorts of nihilists who want to undermine the West. It just so happens that in these couple of instances, they've arrived at the right position purely out of political necessity. What else could I bring up here? What could we talk about? Absolutely. No, don't worry. I actually do like the question because if people don't actually answer questions or ask questions like that and people don't answer them, then I think the world just becomes a far dumber place where all we have is slogans. I would say that well, you're kind of right that Israel wasn't really founded on Marxism. It was just that, and kibbutz in Israel, and I've toured kibbutzes in Israel this year actually. Good thing I wasn't there when all the fighting started. But the thing is that it was actually technically more founded on like trade unionism, which is technically fascism. It's not because that doesn't make, I don't think, Israel a bad place. It means that in 1948, Israel was like a desolate landscape with not much in it. So people were more favorable to big government solutions to problems, in which it actually kind of hampered Israel's growth for the first few decades. Because while they could sort of pretend like, well, it was because of the kibbutzes and it was because of the government infrastructure projects and agricultural projects that saved us, really not. It appeared like it did because Israel survived for the first few decades, but it also hampered their economy and hampered their growth. Since they've become far more free market and far more of a tech center, that's when they've actually done really well to the point where they have an Iron Dome, to the point where literally Arabs move to Israel because it's far better to live in Israel than it is to live in most of the rest of the Middle East. Because unless you are sitting on a pile of natural gas in the Middle East, you're not usually very well off. And even then, if you live in one of those countries, often the benefits do not ever trickle down to you because they're basically run by dictators and oligarchs. Anyways, now maybe it's a great time because someone brought up Israel to talk about Mayor Jyoti Gondek of Calgary. Calgary's Mayor Jyoti Gondek. Man, it's just sad that people like this are even elected in places like Calgary. It's obviously, Calgary is a super conservative city. Like I said before, sometimes there's more of just a Calgary's capitalist more than it's conservative. And I think some people who vote conservative vote more progressive municipally when the conservative labels are not put on the parties or there's no municipal parties, because I think people don't speak conservatism secondhand, so they can't really detect when there's a candidate that's way more liberal than they expected, or they don't really know who a conservative is unless they're specifically labeled as a conservative. Anyway, sorry, I'm going down the rabbit hole a bit, but Jyoti Gondek effectively won because we didn't have good conservative opposition. I generally liked Jeremy Farkas. I voted for Jeremy Farkas. He was a good counselor. I voted for him as mayor. The problem for Jeremy Farkas is he bought into the media lie that he was being too contentious and too divisive in council. So although he actually ran on many conservative things, his style became more, I don't want to say this because a lot of people won't get it. I think enough people will. I'll just say it. He came off very Alberta Party-ish during the mayoral election. The Alberta Party is like supposedly Alberta's centrist party, but they usually are more center-left in their orientation. So Farkas tried to start signaling that he was more progressive on social issues, and through doing that and trying to sort of moderate the tone in which he talked and try not be too contentious, I think he then made himself boring, and he made himself not seem like the decisive conservative people should back. Oddly enough, even though it's a more liberal city, obviously, Rob Ford understood if you want the conservative vote, you got to be the unapologetic conservative in the race. You got to push conservatism, like your conservative bona fides, to the max so that people know that you're not just saying a couple things about some tax cuts and then you're going to be a mostly typically boring John Tory kind of a politician. That's why conservatives in Calgary have not won for the past couple of decades, probably 2 decades at this point, since before Bronconnier, I guess, although Bronconnier wasn't that bad. The problem is that our conservatives always try and like pretend like they're progressive because they buy into the media's idea that municipal politicians have to be these uniters who are, who are pluralistic and whatnot, and they're very much trying to bring the community together. But the progressives they're running against aren't trying to bring the community together. They're only trying to serve progressive union voters. So the conservatives have to realize that any election is going to be one faction of people against another one, not in a toxic tribalistic way, but from an ideas perspective, it's always going to be a people who want lower taxes and more police against the people who don't like the police and want higher taxes and more like bike lanes and whatnot. That's, at the end of the day, it's going to be a clash of ideas. And if you neglect the fact it's a clash of ideas, or you refuse to engage in the fight, you will always lose that fight. But it's great to see that Gondek, not to reiterate my entire video on her, it's fantastic to see that she's basically sunk her own battleship here. Her approval rating was already horrible. It was 36%. And for a mayor, that's insane. Mayors are usually given the benefit of the doubt, even though they have a pretty massive impact on people's day-to-day quality of life. People usually just assume their mayor's doing a good job because it's a very local figure. You're much more likely to have shaken hands with the person who is your current mayor than your MP or your prime minister or whatever. But she's so bad in terms of her approval rating. She's performed so poorly because Naheed Nenshi, our previous mayor, is very progressive. He was super, super progressive. The thing with Nenshi, though, is he was savvy enough to realize that Calgarians weren't going to go with him exactly where he wanted to go on all of his policies. So he moderated himself in a lot of aspects of his sort of policy playbook or his sort of like agenda. Gondek, because she actually used to be a conservative, as weird as it is, I've heard tons of stories of her working on conservative campaigns. But then when she got a PhD in urban sociology and she kind of got the sort of academic attention, and she got a lot of attention from very progressive kind of municipal figures, she became a true believer overnight in progressivism. And so she doesn't actually have the understanding because she was in an academic bubble for so long, whereas Naheed Nenshi had a very long time. He had a very long history of debating conservatives and interacting with conservative ideas. She was kind of a true believer conservative, and then she became true believer progressive because she was always kind of in a bubble, and she's never understood how to talk with people who don't fully don't believe what she already believes. Because I think she assumes people's minds work like hers, that if it's a good idea in her mind, that everyone should believe it's a good idea. So she's been proposing policies ever since she became mayor on pure idealism with zero holdback. So, killing the arena deal because they weren't going to install enough solar panels. She's been literally plowing bike lanes in -30 weather while she's not plowing people's own streets, because people should be promoting we should promote riding bikes. She keeps increasing property taxes despite the fact she ran on a property tax freeze. She was kind of a little bit avoidant on whether she actually was going to raise property tax or not, but every indication she made was that she wasn't going to do it. But, she's attacked the police for trying to clear homeless encampments, and now we've arrived at the point where she now is trying to she will refuse to show up to menorah lighting ceremonies because the organization putting on is pro-Israel, as if the only way she'll interact with a Jew is if that Jewish person hates Israel as much as she does. That's just insane. That would be like if there was a Palestinian event or there was some sort of Ramadan event, and you expected that everyone who was there hates Saudi Arabia, hates Palestine, hates Iran, hates Yemen, hates whatever, Djibouti. Obviously, that's not going to happen. People generally from a group that's associated with a specific country are not generally going to hate that country. Although you could argue with Iranians, because most Iranians hate the regime in Iran. But still, what she was doing was extremely disgusting, to basically imply that unless this group of people would condemn Israel defending itself, regardless of what you think about foreign aid to Israel, if a terrorist attacks your country, if we were attacked by a foreign land on our border and they massacred 1,400 of our people, we wouldn't do this stupid crap that the media does where we count up 1,400 militants and we only kill those 1,400 people. Obviously, we're going to go in and try and wipe out anyone responsible for the crime. And if they're hiding behind human shields, those deaths are on them. But because Jyoti Gondek is both a true believer in progressivism, so she naturally is this kind of Janice Irwin, if anyone knows who Janice Irwin is, an NDP MLA up in Edmonton, because she's this Janice Irwin type who truly believes that Israel is like the root of all evil in the Middle East. And she relies on a lot of these people in kind of this vote bank politics sort of a manner in order to have gotten elected in the first place. She ended up basically sticking her foot in her mouth and not attending an event that she's been to in the past, in which they held the same raffle to support Israeli citizens that she was present and in favor of back in the day. But because she now has to she has to please her base, and she seems to have evolved in an even more left-wing direction ideologically, now she doesn't like. Now she's basically destroying her own career in order to basically pose on people and prove that she's a more loving progressive than everyone else is. But yeah, no, she's just awful overall. She doesn't know what she's doing. Overall, I would say there's a very, very, very good case for a values test to be re-added to Canada's immigration system, and that our immigration system should not specifically be letting in any specific number of people. We should be processing people at the pace that we can actually guarantee that they do not hate our country or hate individuals in our country. And so I think the 500,000 number we currently have is untenable for good national security, as well as, here's the thing with high immigration numbers. It's actually not only bad for the people living here when the housing supply is being outstripped by the number of people entering the country, but we are also doing a massive disservice to the people that we are bringing to this country, pretending we're the land of opportunity and there's tons of jobs everywhere and the affordability is fantastic. Hey, look, Calgary and Vancouver are always in the top 10. But then they come here and they have to share half a basement suite with like 3 other guys just to be able to make ends meet. That's actually kind of weird that we're almost importing a group of people just to, do like meal delivery services and work minimum wage jobs. It's not good for our population to be fighting for jobs against people for younger people to have to fight these people for minimum wage jobs or compete against people for minimum wage jobs. At the same time, we're bringing people here who, as soon as they hit the ground, it's not like they're living in their parents' house and they can work some more smaller jobs before they get better ones and they can afford their own place. We're bringing people here who need their own place because they don't have family here, who again are having to live with other adults they don't know to be able to drive for Uber Eats or work at a 7-Eleven or something like that to barely be able to pay for anything. We're actually basically baiting them out into coming here to work for us for a lifestyle that they cannot afford, because Canada is not a country that you can easily just sort of jump into and just start like casually living here. It's the same thing. Like a better example, or like a more hyperbolic example, is it'd be hard to move to Liechtenstein or Luxembourg or Monaco and just start living there, because the standard of living and what you need to be able to pay for things is so much higher than it is in Canada, and especially higher than somewhere where people are coming in from. Like if you go from India to Monaco, I think everyone would agree that's a bit too big of a jump for the average person from that country. Same thing between, Syria and Canada. It's just really not going to work out. And that there's some people who could probably show up, some people who can't. And the idea that we shouldn't actually input any standards onto that is incredibly disgusting, not only because it hurts people here at home, but it's hurting the people that are specifically coming here as well. Yeah, no, I would generally agree with that. I think that, and the thing is, this was with any policy. So even though I'm running in a conservative nomination, I know a lot of other candidates are more tight-lipped about this. Like anything, and like anything, the correct answer to a certain extent is it depends. Is that you can't just say our country can have 500,000 people coming in every year. It depends. We don't really have the healthcare system or the housing market to justify it right now. It really depends. Just like anything, how much should we spend on X, or how much should we do for X, or how many cops should we have? It depends. If we have bad crime like we do now, we definitely need way more cops, and we have to stop hamstringing them. But if we had super low crime and someone proposed hiring 500, 1,000 new cops, and we didn't exactly have an aging police force that we needed to replace or anything like that, that would be also a stupid idea. Right now, it's obviously it's probably too much. Obviously, it shouldn't have to bear repeating that that everyone knows it's going to have to come down. And I frankly think that a conservative government will adjust it down. They just don't want the grief at the moment, which I think they'll have to bite the bullet at some point. But doesn't really matter. I think it's just one of those things that obviously is going to be taken care of in time. Um, Oh yeah, and you're right, absolutely right, Terry J. And the Indian population in Canada, and I'm not trying to say obviously like Indian people are poor or something like that. Indian people are some of the most successful people by demographic in Canada. On average, they make a crazy amount of money. But these days, you are right. A lot of people coming from India to Canada are not exactly living their best life because the thing is, the opportunities that existed previously for Indian immigrants are no longer here, and we've only become more restrictionist in terms of people being able to become like doctors or be able to have their credentials respected once they come to this country, or being able to buy property in order to start a business. It just is not here anymore. You have to basically come to this country with $300,000 in your pocket, or you're going to be grinding for a couple of decades just to be able to do what people back in the day could do after a few years of living in this country. um, hmm. And so, but anyway, so Gondek with this whole Menorah scenario, I think that she's basically killed off her ability to run for re-election now. She's almost like, I would say, like Canada's Lori Lightfoot, that if she jumps into a race, I think that the progressive union sort of people, the Calgary's Future PAC and Stephen Carter types, are going to run a different progressive against her because she just is too well known for being toxic. And so then again, in response, we need a Rob Ford figure, not Doug Ford, definitely not Doug Ford. We need a Rob Ford figure to run as Calgary's mayor, who nobody could mistake as the conservative, in which case then conservative voters can line up behind that person. I always hate it when people blame individual conservative voters because they are like individual conservative voters because they didn't get behind the right candidate. Like Jody Gondek got like 42% of the vote. Even if every single conservative voter voted for Jeremy Farkas, he would have still lost because there was other progressive or kind of these moderate centrist consultant type people also running. Those are not probably attracting conservative voters. So the problem we have is that when we don't have an obvious conservative running, then voters don't know who to obviously vote for. You need someone who is actually going to polarize a little bit in a good way, actually run on policies that conservative federal and provincial voters can get behind, and then you'll have good voter turnout. Our biggest problem municipally, and this is in almost every city, is voter turnout municipally is low. And you can be in the most progressive city imaginable, and you can win as a conservative because even progressives, NDP and liberals types, they usually don't show up and vote in municipal elections either. So if you run on someone who can get the base out, who can drive out 20% of the city, 15% of the city to come and vote for them, you can win because only about 30 to 40% of people even show up and vote in these mayoral elections in the first place. It's just about turnout. And like, I know someone previously wanted me to make a video on theory of door knocking and how to actually do campaigning. But like a lot of it, and it's politics 101, it's some of the most basic stuff ever. It's almost insulting to even pretend like someone here might not know it. All politics comes down to, not all of it, obviously, but I'm saying like base level, what a lot of elections come down to are branding and name recognition. Can you brand yourself as the conservative, and can you get enough name recognition? So I'm not just saying a guy who's super conservative has to run. If nobody knows who you are, you're just not going to be able to become the mayor. Becoming mayor or getting any high position takes a lot of effort, and you got to be building your narrative on why you should be mayor for at least several years. And you better have had a big name even before you started on your path trying to become mayor. But what we need is someone with a good conservative brand. Nobody doubts they're conservative, and that person isn't going to get scared and pretend they're not as conservative as they are, like Farkas ended up doing. And I like Farkas; he's a nice guy. But I think that he ended up, like so many conservative politicians are in a lot of races, hoodwinked by the media into pretending he wasn't who he was. So, but then we also need name recognition. This person has to be running for mayor for like a year and a half in advance. They got to be very clear about what they're doing. They got to make sure that they're not just sort of throwing their hat in the race because, hey, it's a conservative city and I maybe can win. So that's what we need. We need someone with high name recognition, and they're definitely conservative. That's what Rob Ford did in Toronto. I'm not sure if people remember, he literally came third in his first run at council because even though he was Doug Ford Sr.'s son, and Doug Ford Sr. used to be an MLA in Etobicoke Center, or Etobicoke East or something. He lost when the nomination happened for center against Chris Stockwell. But when Rob Ford lost, came in third place, and it was a distant third, he knew that it wasn't just supposed to kick sand and walk away. Oh, I can't believe I didn't win. It's because after that, every single day, he kept pushing in the media and just in the community as to why he should be the mayor. So he won the account. He became councillor the next election after that because he kept basically campaigning even after he lost. And when he became councillor, he started building his narrative against city waste and corruption, and he just pushed on those few different things. Basically, crime and city spending. That's all he ran on, was bad spending and cracking down on bad crime. So if someone runs in any city in Canada these days, because they're two easy issues, run on cutting property taxes and run on cutting crime. Just make your slogan cutting crime, cutting taxes. That's it. And just say cutting crime, cutting taxes, simple as. That should be the actual slogan if you want to win a municipal race in Canada. But a lot of people, they listen to too many consultants saying, you got to have a platform point about respecting communities, and you have to have something about engaging in bridge building between blah, blah, blah. And you got they end up, consultants turn candidates into people who talk like consultants, and people can tell. I hate most strategy firms in this country, even when they're working for the Conservatives, because they usually just get people to talk about politics in ways that only aliens understand, because all of this stuff doesn't actually matter to anyone. When I hear politicians talking about how we need politicians who respect pluralism more, which is this idea that people have to get along and realize we live in a pluralistic society where we love and respect everyone. It's that's such a meaningless concept. And even just yesterday, I had a politician tell me about pluralism or talk about pluralism, and it was nauseating. Who cares? A lot of and again, these progressives who value these pluralistic ideals are usually the least pluralistic people ever. They hate you no matter what your race, ethnicity, or religion is if you don't 100% agree with them on every issue. That's where conservatives have to not buy into these people's nonsense and act as if they put on these kind of airs of progressive pluralism that they're going to gain voters, because these progressives are phonies. You would get more voters by pointing out these people like Jody Gondek are complete frauds. They're deeply nasty and insular people, and they don't like anyone who doesn't already agree with them on every single social and fiscal issue there is to exist. If you ever to beat these people, you have to expose them as frauds during the elections and not let them be taken at face value by the public. Jody Gondek, Farkas, made a couple of good hits on her. He should have just shredded her as basically a know-nothing, intolerant progressive. That would have been way smarter. But anyways, I'm probably going to start wrapping this video up here. I'm over past an hour, and there's still a good chunk of people watching. But I know that I've been talking about some issues, more nebulous issues, frankly, that I think that it was a bit harder to generate conversations on. But it was still fun. I guess I can still plug the fact that I'm running for the Calgary Signal Hill Conservative Party nomination. So if you happen to live in Calgary Signal Hill, or if you just happen to know people who live in Signal Hill, buy a membership so you can vote yourself, or promote them to vote for me. I'll put a link to my website in the comments of this video. I also just put up a link to my Give Send Go account. I have a legal fund I'm running because I'm being sued by a billionaire. I am winning the lawsuit against this billionaire. It's a completely ridiculous case in which they're claiming defamation in a case where they have submitted no evidence proving defamation, proving anything that we said was wrong, and we submitted piles of evidence proving everything we said was 100% right. It's been a lot of fun, but it's been a lot of fun to fight back in this case, because to a certain extent I've been able to prove the point about not backing down in the media. If you don't back down, most of the time these people fold up and run away. And so far, to the point in the case we're at, basically the guy that's suing me is running away. In his deposition, I think they pretty much had to admit to the fact that even though everything we said about him was based off a Globe and Mail report, they never issued any legal notice to the Globe and Mail. So they're the entire case is spurious. You don't get to wait for the 17,000th person to say something bad about you and then hit them with defamation or a defamation suit because you don't think that they're rich enough to pay for it so that they can't defend themselves. I've been scratching and crawling to pay for this, but so far it's been going quite well. Anyways, that should be it for me today. I don't want to keep dragging this out. Sometimes I start rambling a bit too much because I'm seeing if there's another last minute question, but I can always save it. I'll maybe do another live stream in a few days with Daniel as well, and people can have fun pitching both of us questions. But I'll see everyone. Until then, I'll see everyone later.